All right, I'm very glad to have Assemblymember Ash Kalra from San Jose, California, in the virtual studio with me today. Welcome, Assemblymember.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, the issue on everybody's mind right now is how we came so close to seemingly passing a statewide Medicare for all in California, a state where there are overwhelming Democratic majorities. And so there is none of this. Can we get Republicans on board? Are we going to be able to get even moderate Dems on board? It's a state that is one of the most progressive states in the country, a state that went overwhelming for Bernie Sanders, a state where Medicare for all is overwhelmingly popular. So help us understand what happened.
So, a couple of things. Well, first of all, it was quite a journey over the last year to get the bill where it was, and it wasn't on the verge of passing the legislature. It was on the verge, at least brought to the assembly floor, so the House of Origin, where the bill was introduced, but where I introduced it last year. And so, last year in February, along with our sponsors, the California Nurse Association, and a number of co-authors, I introduced AB 1400. And this is, 4 years prior, there was another effort in California that had gotten through the Senate and then stalled in the Assembly without a hearing. And so, with time passed, because there was a lot of wounds that needed to be healed from a few years ago, I introduced the bill, and it was starting to go through the process in the Assembly. And what happened was a few years ago, one of the issues that the speaker, I mean, it's the same speaker, Speaker Rendon, one of the issues he had was that the policy bill was brought to the assembly and it didn't have any financing mechanism. There was no conversation about the constitutional issues that exist and what have you. So those conversations we began those conversations in earnest with the speaker's office, with the nurses, all of us kind of in these internal meetings, just trying to say, okay, how do we get a path forward on this? And the result last year was that the speaker indicated that, look, we actually did write up a financing mechanism. We wrote up, and gave it to our legislative council, so it was in draft. Dealing with the constitutional issues, the speaker essentially gave the option: hey, if you put that into AB 1400, this bill will be referred to a committee, to Revenue and Taxation Committee. The problem was twofold, and this is back in April. The problem then was twofold. One is now, because the financing was put into AB 1400, it made it a two-thirds vote instead of a majority vote. Secondly, because we only had a few days to present it before the committee, and the committee is a rather moderate committee, it was going to fail in the committee. I think that the sense that putting it before the committee on that short notice with the tax that was going to be over $100 billion, it was going to fail. And what we did was, I opted to not hold or to not have that bill hearing and to continue to have conversations with the speaker's office. I asked him, would you keep an open mind to have two separate bills? He said he would. At that time, the nurses did condemn me for not putting it forward to committee, but AB 1400 would have died last April if we had done that. And what happened in the ensuing months, working with the nurses, working with the speaker's office, I went to DC, met with the Department of Health and Human Services to get in detail the process of a waiver application, because you would have to get that in order for this to be successful and to get the funding for the federal government. Fast forward, now we're getting into November and December, and at that point, the speaker's office agreed, okay, you can have two separate bills. And that was a big win, because what that did was it allowed the policy bill, AB 1400, to move forward with the majority vote, and it gave us more time to work on the funding mechanism and constitutional issues that would have to be placed before the voters. That didn't have a deadline to get through the assembly. And when I mentioned the deadline, since the bill was introduced last year, and it wasn't heard in the first year, it became what's called in our terminology a two-year bill, which means that it has to get through the House of Origin, in this case the State Assembly, by January 31st of this year. And so it was good news, though, that it was separated out. I met with the chair of the Health Committee, had a really good conversation, just trying to get him to agree to hear the bill. Ultimately, when we introduced the separate mechanism for funding, at that time, the bill was referred, AB 1400 was referred to the Health Committee. This is in mid-January. It's referred to the Health Committee. And other good news is the chair of the Health Committee, who previously had never expressed a position, said he would support the bill. And that makes a big difference when the chair gives a yes recommendation. And so we present the bill. We're able to get it through the Health Committee. Immediately has to go to the Appropriations Committee the next week. And I meet immediately with the Appropriations Chair, At this time, when it gets to health committee, I set aside 20 plus hours to have one-on-one Zooms with my colleagues because prior to that, the bill had never been heard in a policy committee. So for members that are not sitting on that policy committee, because there's a lot of 2-year bills, they're not going to presume that all of them are going to be coming before them on the floor. We didn't get as many questions. We didn't have as much dialogue, only because even though I'd reached out to folks, there wasn't as much interest in a bill that at that point hadn't been moving forward. And so the reason why I mentioned that is that essentially after health committee, we only had a couple weeks to try to convince a majority of the assembly to get on board with AB 1400. You correctly point out that we do have a supermajority of Democrats. However, we did have 4 vacancies. So ordinarily we have 60 Democrats. We're down to 56. There are 19 Republicans and 1 independent who's essentially a Republican. He was a Republican. So that's 20 votes. They're not going to vote for it. We're down to 56 votes. And not everyone, unfortunately, campaigns in favor of single payer or is in favor of single payer in the legislature. And there are a number of folks that are very much, kind of corporate and, do the bidding of a lot of these corporations. Now, that being said,
you said that you believed that the bill would fail by double digits. That's more than just a few folks out of those. Can you name who you think would have ultimately killed the bill?
Well, this is where we were as we fast forward to the Monday where the bill is being heard. Because yes, I do believe that it would have. I think at worst we probably would have gotten 28 votes. At best, I'm guessing 30 or 31 votes. So anywhere from 10 to 13 votes shy.
But here's the question that people want to know the answer to. We are now speculatively talking about how the vote would have gone down. If there had been a vote, it would be out of the realm of speculation, and people would have to defend the fact that they voted down this overwhelmingly popular proposal. So why not force the vote?
And that's what I want to get to. And so when it comes to Monday morning, and by the way, my staff, me and my staff, and the nurses are sharing the same Google Doc with the exact same vote count. We know where we are. We know we come to Monday, we're at 28 votes. And the reason why we don't it's not like a week before. We're using every day talking to members, trying to get them on board. In the final 24 hours, what have you, there are folks that just aren't there yet because we're trying to get them there in a meeting with them, answering their questions. This is why I made the decision. And the nurses have the names as well. I mean, it's not but this is the reason why I made the decision, and the reason why I believe it's important for us to continue to work to get folks into the SCOM. And so one of the reasons why is that next year, we have the most vacancies we've had in 10 years. Out of those open seats, not all of them are in kind of progressive areas. Some of them it's going to probably be a Republican winning. Some of them are a little bit more purple areas. And so I think at the very worst, we're going to get 4 new members that are going to be very publicly for single payer. Corporate free, I'm endorsing a lot of these candidates. At best 9, my guess it'll be between 4 and 6 members that will come in that will be more favorable next year. What that basically means is that we need 5 to 7 incumbents that are going to continue to be serving in the years ahead to come on board. And a lot of them we were having really good conversations with, but again, we ran out of runway. We ran out of time.
Well, help me to understand this. Listen, I'm getting a little lost, and I'm sure the same is true of the listeners. There's 2 bills. There's the 2 prongs. It's the Medicare for all part, and then there's the financing part. And please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing those.
Sure,
parts.
Absolutely.
The Medicare for all part needs only a bare majority to pass.
That's right.
Correct? Okay.
The policy
part needs a bare majority. Yeah. And you're saying you need a 2/3 majority for the financing aspect. Can you remind me why it is that the financing part needs the 2/3 majority?
Good question. It's because in order to put something on the ballot, you need to get a 2/3 vote of the legislature. And in this case, if we're able to do that, it only needs a majority vote at the ballot. And so that's the reason. That's just a policy that's been in place for a long time. Where in order to put it on the ballot, because of the nature.
So I'm sorry. So the policy part isn't on the ballot in the same way that the financing part is quote on the ballot?
No, and there's a reason for that. And this also has to do with the federal Medicare waiver. The reason why when I met with the Department of Health and Human Services, a couple of the key things they said is, in order for the governor to even apply for a federal Medicare waiver, you have to have legislative authority. And what that clearly means, and we asked all the very direct follow-up questions, is that you have to have a bill passed by the legislature. It does not. It has to have the policy. It does not have to have the funding mechanism. And the reason that kind of logically makes sense is the policy design speaks to not only how expensive it'll be and what the cost will be, the policy design also speaks to the Medicare waiver, and you'll know how much you're going to get from the federal government. And that'll better explain exactly how much you would need in taxation for the delta in order to fund the system.
I think what might be helpful is to just take this moment to clarify what this Medicare waiver does, how the Medicare waiver enables the California state Medicare for All program.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to shorten my intro when I was talking about going to DC, but this is a really important point.
Yeah.
Is that in order to get a single payer program in any state, you have to get a federal Medicare waivers. And there are in existence operating over half a dozen. They're not full single payer programs, but they're unique kind of targeted programs to expand healthcare. There are certain conditions under a Medicare waiver program under the Obama administration that are still in existence. They survived through Trump. The waiver program survived through Trump and is still in existence. And so it has to expand healthcare. It has to be at least budget neutral to the federal government. And so those are the two key factors that you can't be contracting. You can't be privatizing healthcare because Trump tried to use the waiver program for that. It's got to be an expansion of services to the community. And it's got to be at least cost neutral to the federal government.
When we say Medicare waiver, I'm sorry to be so pedantic, but what do we mean by that?
So what we basically want to mean is that there's a number of federal programs and that bring federal money into the healthcare system. And in order to have a true single payer system, it can't be single payer plus Medi-Cal plus Medicare. It's got to be all the money has to come into one fund. In order to do that, you have to get permission from the federal government. Now, over 70% of our money into our healthcare system, right, in California alone, is already public money. It's state and federal funds. But if we don't get a Medicare waiver, it will be impossible to have a single payer system. And that's why it was really important for me to follow a timeline that works with the federal Medicare waiver process. And that's why, and that was part of how I was able to make my argument with the Speaker's office. Hey, this is why it makes sense to separate the two. And so it ended up being a good result in that regard in terms of separating the two. Now, at the end of the day, we still need, and this was actually harmful to us, when Governor Newsom distances himself from AB 1400 in single payer after campaigning on it. That really hurt because I'm trying to get colleagues of mine to vote for it, and I have a whole timeline. First we have to get this bill through, then we ask for federal waiver. And they're like, well, doesn't the governor have to sign the bill? I'm like, yes, but we will have to push the governor to do that. But a lot of folks, it really kind of dampened the spirits in terms of trying to get folks on board.
Well, he ran on it. He ran on it. And there's clip after clip of him being very forceful, a very forceful advocate of the need for Medicare for all while he was running and while he was in the midst of his election campaign.
That's right.
A recall campaign, rather. Sorry.
Absolutely. And so there's Medicare, and there's a number of other federal programs. And when we spoke with HHS, and by the way, we met with the deputy secretary. We weren't meeting with, some low-level staffer, although I have a lot of respect for staffers as well. There were some staffers in the room that were actually really had great expertise on the waiver program that helped answer a lot of questions. But in terms of were we getting the real answer, we were meeting with at the end of the day, a Medicare waiver for California is going to go to even above that guy's head. I mean, it's of such significance. But let's keep in mind, Vermont did get a Medicare waiver for a single payer program. The problem they had is they didn't address the funding until after they went through that entire process. We didn't want to make that mistake. We want to make sure that we're starting to address funding earlier on. It doesn't have to be on the exact timeline, but at some point, if we're going to go to the voters, I want a policy passed so we can tell the voters, this is exactly what you're going to get. Here's the taxation, bill that you can vote on. This is exactly how much it's going to cost. And that way, if people really, because it's in theory, in polling, people principally are for single payer. Most of those people didn't know AB 1400 existed. That was part of the education program. Hey, by the way,
why is
we
that?
have a program here.
Why is that? 'Cause I've heard you in interviews say that you had colleagues that were being called and called and called, and there was all of these ads that were running in opposition to AB 1400. Yeah. Why was there not more of an effort? What was the holdup? Was there financing issues for funding commercials, ads, flyers, whatever it is? social media, you're in California, every celebrity in the world is there who could potentially be elevating this cause. Why did it seem like this was something that kind of came up under the radar and then dissipated before anybody could take notice?
It's hard to compete with the amount of money that comes in. I mean, they were doing text campaigns against me. I had folks, I went to law school in DC, so they clearly got into my kind of donor fund or friends that had given to me, because I had friends in DC that got text messages. I mean, so they were doing a very broad, expansive campaign. It's hard. It's really hard. And the nurses did an extraordinary job over the course of the last few months. Activists, Healthcare for All Los Angeles, Santa Clara County Single Payer Health Coalition. It's not for a lack of trying. The activists on the ground were doing the best they could. The problem is that most people, to get to the electorate, it takes multiple contacts. And that means you have to get people that are actually interested and engaged. And it's hard. It's hard to do that. And it takes a lot of work. Time is our friend in this situation. In this case, we didn't have as much time compared to the amount of time the opposition had, because all they have to do is run a bunch of social media ads and radio ads. And they were just blasting it all over them. So what happened was they were having folks calling in that are saying, you're raising our taxes. Obviously they just use fear tactics, and it's much more nuanced for us to be able to respond like, well, you're actually going to pay a lot less, because that's a fact. We currently pay $220 billion.
That seems pretty direct, and doesn't require a ton of nuance. Well, but let me ask you this, Assembly member. Do you think that if there had been a forced vote on this bill and there had been any number of ostensibly progressive Democrats voting it down, that would have generated a level of media interest that would have helped you for the next fight down the road?
And that's a great question. That's really what the question comes down to, is what is better for the survival of the policy? Because in my decision was based on making the policy survive over my own politics. The politics for me was easy. Put it up for a vote. I'm, one of the most progressive members of the legislature. I'm one of only two that doesn't take corporate money. And so let me get to the reason of my reasoning behind it.
Sure.
So out of the folks that you would, there are about 26 to 28 or so Dems that would not have voted for it. Some would have voted no. Some would have just not voting, which is the same effect, right?
Out of how many again?
Out of 56. So about half or a little less, right? We had half that I strongly believe we're going to vote yes. They told us we're going to vote yes. So out of 56, we had 28 ayes. We probably could have squeezed 2 or 3 more. So let's just, for argument's sake, say there's 26 members that are Democrats that didn't.
And are these people who had publicly supported Medicare for all in the past?
No, none of them. And that's the thing people don't realize. People are not campaigning. Like I campaigned, in favor of single payer back in 2016. Some other members did as well. Most members don't campaign in favor of single payer health. It doesn't mean they're necessarily against it, but they don't campaign. That's not a campaign promise, right? And so, but out of those 26, there's a number that are leaving the legislature. I would say about 14 to 16 of them or so are going to be returning. Out of those, we only need about 5 to 7 of those to be in the affirmative next time around. When we get anywhere from 4 to 6 new yes members, that is enough to help push the conversation, push it even closer to a 41 vote. And the reason why I think it would be damaging to put it up for a vote is the reality of the politics in California. It's not like in DC where hundreds, need another 100 votes, 100 co-authors, what have you. Here, the situation is such that, first of all, our assembly districts are about 500,000 people. And so I know it sounds really good for us to be able to say, well, we're going to see who voted for it, and if they don't, we're going to vote them out. In the last 10 years, only one progressive challenge from the left actually has won. And it won because of a coalition that came together and that spent a whole ton, like millions of dollars, in favor of the progressive in order to beat back the corporate-backed candidate, incumbent. And so there's a reality, and there's what we would like to do, and there's a reality what will actually happen.
But it's similar, if you have to replace the person to get the vote either way, whether or not they vote it down and are exposed, or they never vote on it and aren't exposed, you have to shift those numbers. You have to replace them with people who would be positive. It isn't the job of replacing them with someone who is in favorable of Medicare for all, which again is overwhelmingly popular in the state, made easier by revealing the extent to which that they are opposed to Medicare for all, that they have voted down a bill.
And so we are getting some replacements coming in that are favorable. And that's part of the calculation. Again, anywhere from, I believe, 4 to 6 members or so will come in new seats. We have a bunch of open seats. So we have 4 to 6 brand new members, not replacing incumbents.
I see.
Now, And so those incumbents, what would happen is, in my estimation, based upon the experience of what I've seen with challenges that happen here, is that they'll win their reelection having not voted for single payer, having and become hardened in a position that right now we can get them out of. I'm not talking people that are going to vote no. There are some not voting folks that we've had really good conversations with. I believe that we can get to a yes position with more time, and I truly
Why do
believe
you
that.
believe that? What kinds of things are being said in these conversations? Because I know that a lot of listeners are going to feel skeptical because a lot of
Absolutely.
listeners' belief is that people who are opposed to this bill are doing so because they are captured. They have been bought off by these pharmaceutical companies that have given an enormous amount of money to interests in the state, including Gavin Newsom, which many people believe explains his flip flop. If I can just read a little bit from
Of
David
course.
Sirota's reporting in the Daily Post. Poster. Blue Shield of California has been a huge donor to Newsom and state Democrats, as well as the governor's pet causes. Blue Shield has donated at least $99,000 to Newsom's campaign since 2010 and $2.7 million to the California Democratic Party since 2006. And Blue Shield isn't the only one. It's Anthem Insurer and United Health Group and the whole lot of them. We're talking millions of dollars to the Democratic Party and individual candidates alone. How confident are you, or more specifically, why are you so confident that newcomers won't flip and that people who might be with you now can't be pressured to flip given how much money is in the mix?
On the first point, some of the newcomers, like a number of them, are already corporate-free candidates, and so we believe that we're going to double or triple. And it sounds like a lot, but what I'm saying is going from 2 to 6. But still, that's significant, right? There's only 2 of us that are corporate-free right now. I believe that number will go as high
There's
as,
only two. I'm so sorry. There's only
yeah,
two people out of the
yeah.
56 assembly members in California that are corporate free.
There are only 2 out of 120 legislators. Me and Alex Lee. I know.
What
That's what
is going on in
I,
California?
but let me tell you this though: a lot of those that aren't corporate free are very progressive. They vote progressively. There were for single payer. There were co-authors on this bill. But yeah, I think there should be more.
What
Hundred
do I
percent.
care about that? What they say? I mean, that's the whole point. Everyone can say, Gavin Newsom can say he's very progressive and supports Medicare for all. And none of it matters.
No, I mean like a lot of the co-authors, a lot of those that voted for it in committee that will continue to vote for it aren't corporate free. But I agree with you. Look, I'm trying to get more folks to become corporate free because I think that you're right. Like even if someone you can say one thing, but at the end of the day, that connection is there. And let me answer the second question because you asked it. So that's
Sure.
one part of it is we have newcomers coming in that I think give me a lot of hope in the years ahead on a lot of progressive policies. Number two is why wouldn't they just to continue to be pressured? Part of it is fear based, and what I mean by that is in if they believe and that there was just a common common knowledge was that we didn't have the votes. Although, no one knew exactly. I mean, the nurses and I knew where we were, but the reality is that we were going to be significantly short. And what happens there is that people, you're going to have those that are always going to vote no, and they're going to internally, work on behalf of the corporations and try to defeat single payer. 100%. And they're in the ear of my colleagues too. And they're not saying that we're doing this for the insurance. They're giving the arguments that are commonly put out there against single payer. But there's going to be a group that are legitimately scared because these folks do put a lot of money into campaigns. And so if are they going to go up on a vote that's going to lose? And, as much as I love being progressive and being corporate, the real reality is that in those seats where they're running for reelection, industry is the one that's going to pump in millions to try to defeat them. And so my point is that if we can get a closer vote count, which we will be able to do next year, and there are legitimate questions in that we weren't able to get as complete of an answer as they'd like in a couple of weeks. I also understand that,
But
look,
why
people
were
can
we
vote.
in this a couple of weeks land? I mean, you mentioned this. The same attempt was done in 2017, and you say the issue at that point was that the financing wasn't in order. Okay, you reintroduce this bill for this round, for this bite of the apple. You say you want to get the financing done in a more timely manner this time than was done last time or was done in Vermont. And yet we're still
Mhm.
in this catch-up land. Why not contemporaneously introduce the financing when you reintroduce the policy part of the bill?
Yeah, that was part of the conversation at that time. It's not in earlier on. The policy bill was introduced at that time. Our sponsors didn't want to introduce financing at that time. We weren't prepared to at that moment. I'm talking about last year in February. It wasn't until April that the bill was held, I'm the first in 20 plus years of single payer legislation being introduced. I'm the first one to actually introduce financing. And so,
Why is that though? You know, like
it's
that just
because,
seems.
yeah,
Mhm.
I know.
Go ahead.
And listen, I'm equally as frustrated because now the burden is on the nurses and me now to have to answer. Oh, it's going to be $160 billion in taxes. Well, no, you're going to save money. All these questions could have been answered a long time ago if people took it more seriously. This is a much more serious endeavor. And because of that, I truly believe that we have a better chance than ever to move it forward. We're going to have a better vote count next year. I think that pressure is going to help us move this past the
But that still
41
doesn't
vote.
answer the question, Assemblymember, of why people weren't taking it more seriously. You had a national campaign in 2016 talking about a national single payer system, and you had it again in 2020. You had overwhelming enthusiasm for it, in particular in California, which, even though the media never mentions it, Bernie Sanders won.
I know. That's right.
Right? Like the people are on board. So why isn't it, if we could get a presidential campaign that was prepared to implement Medicare for all, that and given the overwhelming interest in this issue, all the policy wonks that I'm sure would have put their heads together for free to get something like this effectuated. Why is it that we're having conversations about financing like someone just invented the concept
I
of
know.
Medicare for all yesterday?
And it's not only that, Brianna. I mean, even in every study. So the study of the bill from 2017 made it very clear that single payer will save money. The governor has his
Yes.
Healthy California for All commission. The studies continue to show. And so I think it's common knowledge. I think every legitimate academic study shows single payer healthcare will save money.
Yes.
And so I agree with you, but I also think that at the end of the day, like when I introduced the ACA 11, which is the funding mechanism, I was doing a ton of interviews, local news, the newspaper, and the headline is, "Oh, Californians want to tax you," right? That was the headline was not, "We want to bring down your healthcare costs," which is a reality. I mean, we saw that Bernie had that same problem in he was honest about it in the
Yeah, but he
presidential
won.
campaign.
But he won California. Here's the thing.
Yeah,
I want to know, did you reach out to Bernie? Was there any effort to get national level figures who already have the public trust in many respects on this issue to come out in endorsement of this bill and to gin up interest and attention to it?
yeah. So I mean, there was definitely efforts. I know the nurses put a lot of time and effort into the campaign. They were kind of focused on the public campaign. You know, Adi Birkin was phenomenal. He actually lives here in Santa Barbara County, and he actually was one of our expert witnesses at the committee. I love that guy, and he was very impactful. You know, I think in because he's so well versed in it, and also has the personal. He has kind of both. And let me mention, because you know, I was a Bernie delegate. I mean, I was one of the POs. I voted against the Democratic platform for a number of reasons, including not supporting single payer. We won. You know, the Bernie Sanders campaign won here um, because people were on the ground for weeks. That's the kind of campaign we would need for single payer healthcare. The nurses were doing a great job in getting that moving, but the problem with legislation versus a candidate is that it's actually a lot harder to get that the information out because it is much more nuanced. It's an actual piece of legislation. You know, folks are in favor of single payer again in theory and principle, but then when the attack ads start coming and hitting people on social media and it's going to cost this much, you're going to lose your Medicare. You know, things like that scare the crap out of people, and it scares some of my colleagues. Like, wait a second, you know, I have a lot of seniors that people are calling, so they're going to lose their Medicare. It's going to take more time for us. And one of the things that I want to do, for example, with the nurses is put a calculator where you can plug in how much you're paying for premiums, copays now, and what it's going to cost. We just didn't have the time and resources to do that in a relatively short time frame because the ACA wasn't introduced until the beginning of January
But but why?
because that's when it wasn't until the time that was put in during the course of the interim session didn't end until September. I go to DC in October. I meet with Health and Human Services. Come back. It wasn't until November, December timeframe that we're actually saying, okay, now we're going to have two separate bills, and then we have to introduce the ACA, and then we have to, you know, try to make articulate to the world, you know, why the taxation is cheaper. I mean, it's factually true. The problem is the headlines. We're battling not only the opposition, we're
But
battling the headlines.
why the time crunch? I'm just trying to identify. It's not I'm not coming to this from a blaming perspective per
Mhm.
se, but a problem solving perspective. What is it? Did you not have enough, staffers? Is there not? I mean, I've had conversations with people here in DC about how progressives in particular struggle because they want to pay their staffers a living wage, That means sometimes fewer personnel. They can't rely on the think tanks that moderates can, because the things that are coming out of CAP aren't necessarily the things that progressives are on board with. So they have to internalize basically their whole policy process, or find people like Matt Bruning out the world of the few institutions that exist that
Yeah.
are lefty in nature. And they're genuinely under more stress to come up with things and write legislation and do things kind of separate and independent from the Democratic Party without that infrastructure. So what I'm asking you is, why the delay? Is it a funding issue? Because if that's the case, I'm sure that a lot of people that were tired of donating to just, Democratic national candidates to get in Congress and not do anything because they don't have the numbers might be happy to donate to the ability to get these bills drafted in a timely manner in California, with the belief that if California gets Medicare for all, it will be a trickle down effect that will affect them eventually. So what is it? Is it just a planning? Was it just a mistake? Like, oops, we should have introduced this.
It's a couple of things. I mean, one is the 2-year bill process that put in, not artificial, is actually a constitutional deadline of having it through in January, coupled with the fact that we had one bill and we were seeking to have it 2 bills. And then you add into that staffing. The reality was that, Carmen Comsty with the nurses is phenomenal. I'm out there becoming as much of an expert on this bill and just being able to argue and debate with folks. But we do need more surrogates that actually know the nuts and bolts of the bill, as opposed to generally being in favor of single payer. The CalCare bill itself, I believe, is the best policy that's ever been written of the numbers of bills that have come through in the last 20 years. But I think we do need more folks that can speak and articulate and go on the radio, go into neighborhood association meetings, because the nurses did a great job of getting district they had district leaders and all that. But in some of the meetings that even the nurse groups had with some of the members, I mean, understandably, they can't answer all the nuanced questions that come from members. I think we need more folks that can actually get into the weeds and answer questions and answer media requests, because there aren't enough of us for certain. And I say that with the acknowledgement that the nurses did a phenomenal job of getting
Well, this is why
grassroots
I'm
folks.
asking, did you guys reach out to people like Bernie or even Elizabeth Warren, who have been national surrogates for Medicare for all in the past? And did they get back to you?
I didn't, but I wasn't focusing on the public campaign. I was focusing on the policy. Like, the nurses did the public campaign, and they did get a lot of great folks on board and get a lot of folks that were supportive to come out and chime in in favor of it. But I think there's more work that can be done. There's no doubt about it.
That also doesn't get to the question, which is actually about the timing aspect of it. Because here's the thing. I'm anticipating that listeners are going to think there is a way that you can calculate and plan things that they're designed to fail by saying, oh, I started this late and we ran out of time. Oh, we ran up against this deadline. In the same way that there is cover provided by not forcing a vote. I can pretend to be for something during an election season, and then I know I'm never going to have to be accountable for my beliefs. Right. And so I guess what I'm looking for is some assurance that this isn't just a smoke and mirrors, isn't some kabuki dance to disguise the extent to which there was no intention to get this thing passed. Because it doesn't seem to me unpredictable that you would need a financing component, especially since that was the very issue that held you up in 2017 and also in Vermont, to your point.
Yeah, I mean, and that was a big kind of part of the process, was not only introducing financing, but getting 2 separate bills. And I think that a lot of folks, some of my colleagues included, didn't expect the bill to even get through 1, let alone 2 policy committees and get to the floor, especially given the fact that
why not? There's Democratic supermajorities, and like 86% of Democrats in the state support it, and 60-odd% of likely voters support it. Like, this is getting
it doesn't necessarily translate to support for the specific policy. I think there was, and that's part of the work that has to be done.
But there is no specific policy until the 11th hour, because we don't even get the financing bill until February of 2022, right?
Well, no, the financing bill was in the beginning of January.
Okay, excuse me.
Yeah, but you're right.
January of 2022.
This is the first time that it's been done. Like, there's been several iterations of single payer in the past where financing was never introduced. And part of the reason why is because either it wasn't taken as seriously, or because they know that it's harder to get a policy forward when the financing is introduced. And now you have kind of the financing is the more complex and the more difficult aspect of it. And now it's in the public realm, and you're dealing with questions on financing at the same time as the policy. And so I look at, when we got this through health committee, we're pushing through. My goal was to get 41 votes. I mean, it wasn't an endeavor to say, well, we're not going to get the vote, so let's hold the bill at all. I mean, it wasn't until the day of the vote that we realized, look, we're stuck. We're at a point where we're just not getting enough votes. The nurses were on your page and many other pages that's put it up to a vote. The reason why I think differently on that is that is because of the moment. At this moment, 1 year from now, we're going to have, again, a number of new members in not replacing incumbents, replacing folks that are leaving the legislature that are in favor. And then on top of that, we're only going to need anywhere from 5 to 6, 7 tops of the incumbents to get on board. And
but how would forcing the vote on that today, this month, have changed that moment a year from now? How would it make it worse?
This goes back to what I was talking about earlier, the difficulty of challenging an incumbent. In reality, not in theory. The reality is that we have seats that are 500,000 people or so of voters. And ballots are coming out in less than 3 months now. If folks think that they can challenge an incumbent in 3 months' time and defeat them, it's just not a reality. The only time, again, but
it's not about. But I think the people okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Let me just finish that point, and what will happen is because I've seen this happen in other situations, is they don't vote for single payer. They get blasted from the left. They get a challenge from the left or whatever. They beat it. They come back and say, well, I didn't vote for single payer. All these folks came in. There's a lot of ego involved here. Okay. A lot of these folks came after me. I still beat them. They get hardened in their position. It gets harder to get that 5 to 7 votes that we need. It's a strategic, and I know my colleagues, it's a strategic play in making sure the policy can survive. I believe if it was more of that slash and burn in this case, I think it would have made it such that we wouldn't have a policy successful for another 3 or 4 years that could start moving through the legislature. I think now, by doing it this way, we can come back next year, get those handful, 6, 7 votes we're going to need from the incumbents, get the new members, and we'll have 41, because there'll be more pressure next year with new members coming in supporting it. That's just, because remember, they're still going to get opposition from the corporatists, and they're going to get that. I think it'll relieve the pressure if they know that, okay, this is something that's winnable, as opposed to having to, not going up on a bill that's not going to pass, or going up on a bill that's not going to pass.
Okay, help me understand what I'm missing, because it seems to me that if I'm ex-moderate, who although the public doesn't know, is not willing to vote for this, they probably are whoever's going to challenge them, you said 3 months from now, is going to do it. Those campaigns are already in full swing. So whether or not somebody challenges them and quote unquote hardens their position it's not going to be on the basis of this vote. Will this vote, them voting down the bill, become a part of the campaign that's already ongoing? Sure. And will some of those candidates lose in challenging incumbents? Of course. But it's difficult for me to see if someone is hardened in their views already and is probably already getting dinged for not being as progressive as the constituency they represent, that a public vote on this issue is going to be dispositive as to whether or not it's going to be, the vote tally is going to be better a year from now. There does, however, to me, seem to be obvious upsides to having a vote. Not just getting people on the record, but also elevating this issue to in the press in a way that you've articulated you've struggled with. And also, I gotta say, you are very personally taking a lot of blowback for not forcing a vote on this issue. And your kind of credibility is also implicated in all of this. And it's difficult for me to understand, why those factors aren't militating in favor of going ahead and having the vote. Unless you have specific members in mind who have basically said to you, if you force a vote for me this year, I'm 100% not going to vote with you next year. And you have confidence that there is any real chance that they're not just bluffing about voting for you next year. I don't see how it makes a difference. And I also would be very, very skeptical of anybody who's telling you behind closed doors, yeah, totes, not this year, but the next year, because the financing, timing, yada, yada, whatever,
Yeah. So two things. One is I absolutely knew that the way I'm putting it is I'm protecting the policy at my own political peril. I know that I was going to get the brunt of the blowback. That was without a doubt. And I'm okay. I was okay with that. Not everyone that was not voting for it is hardened in their position. And I know this because there are other issues that have come up over the last few years on progressive legislation, whether it be environmental, whether it be labor rights, whether it be immigration issues, where people have changed from year over year from not voting to a yes position. And so that's where, from experience, I know that it is possible, even on tough issues, even on tough votes.
But these are corporate candidates. These are candidates that take corporate money.
But I'm not talking about the ones.
But everybody does in California, apparently, except for two.
And so almost everyone does. So the reality is I have seen that change of heart, and not even change of heart. I've seen a change of a vote from a not voting to a yes position because of a couple of factors, because you can get the vote count up and because you have more of an opportunity to engage. And that was my calculation. Was it right or wrong? Like I'm more than happy to have folks say that you're completely wrong on this, but I just want to make it clear that it was a calculation based on what I believe will survive, have the policy survive, and have the best chance of passing next year. It was going to die on Monday either way. The question is whether it goes to a vote or not. And I believe by having the vote, those folks that I believe are movable, are going to continue to be more movable by not having a vote versus having it. And that was my take on it. It was done in a relatively short period of time. Could I be wrong? Absolutely. Have I been wrong before? Absolutely. I was right in April, though. I was condemned for not having the bill go to policy committee in April. It would have died then. And by not doing that, it allowed 1,400 to survive. Does it mean I was right this time? Absolutely not. I absolutely could be wrong. And so I take all that criticism that you should have done it differently. You should have forced a vote. Legitimate arguments, both sides and both ways, in my opinion.
So when you say it would have died, what you mean is that it would have been voted down and you would have had to reintroduce it again?
Yeah, it would have been voted down. And, I think that when a bill, that's why part of this year's success is getting it through the policy committee is a sign of success in terms of the movement of the bill. And I think it gives it a much greater chance of success next year.
And can you help me understand, this thing died in 2017, you brought it back, the cycle of, how long it takes for things to pass through all of these committees seems to be so long. Like, what is the real difference? Why does it matter if something is voted down and brought back versus kept alive, but you can't do anything for another year?
Well, if it was going to die on that Monday either way, it was going to die either through a vote of everyone or by not being heard. And
Right.
So the advantage we have is that next year we can introduce a bill in the beginning of a 2-year cycle. And I think that it takes away that timeline crunch that we had at the beginning of this year. And I
that
think
wouldn't have happened if it had been voted on? You couldn't introduce it at the beginning of the cycle if it had been voted down?
It's the same timeline. You can always introduce a new bill in the beginning of a 2-year cycle.
So what is this conversation about? Like, because this has been a conversation in other kind of force of vote context. People say, well, the bill would have died, as though you have to start from scratch in a way that is going to extend the timeline or make things harder. It's like, who cares? We know it's good. Help me understand why it's being framed like that all the time.
Well, I mean, either way, you start from scratch, whether the bill is heard or not, 100% correct. And so I think that in this case, given the current makeup of the legislature, the highest turnover we're seeing in 10 years, introducing a new bill next year by having at least 4 to as many as half a dozen more co-authors from day one, having a health committee chair that we know now will be supportive changes the calculus, because a lot of issues are raised even through the health committee analysis that we can work with our health committee chair now in cooperation to answer those questions in advance. And I think all those things are made easier and make it easier to get those votes on board that were not voting this year, that we can get them on board. And so that's why, I mean, it does have to be, we need, cooperation from colleagues. We need to have a process that's coalition building. And I think that this way allows for that coalition building, because at the end of the day, you need both. You need both coalition building inside the building and outside. And I think the manner in which I handled it allows for more of that coalition building inside. I may have lost credibility outside the building, but I think that at least with those members that I believe I can move to a yes, I gained some credibility there. And I think that in combination with the work that the nurses do outside the building, it's a recipe for success.
Why not
Even
name
though it got a
names?
lot of people upset with me, I truly believe it's a recipe for success.
Why not name names and identify those who are kind of a soft no versus a hard no?
Well, I think that those that are not votings, that aren't a no or a yes, but are not votings, which is the same effect for the vote. There are a number of folks that I believe I can get to a yes. And I think that the idea of not putting it to a vote is so that it doesn't isolate them and cement them in. And when I say cement them in a position, what I mean is like, they didn't vote for it. And now they're getting hit for not voting because in a lot of these races, there isn't a progressive challenger, right? And so there may be one, in the next few days, but the reality is that they're going to win re-election.
But here's the thing: there's all of this discourse about how people are concerned in the course of their re-election campaigns about getting dinged for supporting Medicare for all because the government's going to take away their Medicare or whatever. But there's never any conversation about this other huge group of people who would think negatively of those candidates for not supporting Medicare for all, which seems really asymmetrical given we're talking about a state where there's an overwhelming amount of support from Democrats and a significant amount of support, over a majority of support among likely voters.
Yeah, it does. I mean, the reality is on the ground. I mean, look, when I ran in 2016, I was very much in favor of single payer healthcare. I had over $6 million spent against me. It wasn't necessarily my position, for or against single payer that helped me win, but I had tons of people on the ground. I mean, for over 16 months, we knocked on doors almost every single day. That's how we beat back over $6 million. That's the kind of campaign we need to get a single payer passed, which I believe the nurses have built the structure for. But now we need the people to show up, not just when there's a policy bill up for a vote, but over the course of the months ahead to actually get it to a point where it becomes enough of a needle moving issue in a campaign that has candidates paying more attention to it. Because even again, in theory, you have 80% so that say, yes, I support single payer in theory. That's not translating to an impact on the electorate in an actual assembly race or a Senate race. The Senate race here has a million people. The assembly race has almost 500,000. And so, yeah, you might have some single payer activists that do a tremendous job of trying to create some noise on the issue. But we need to expand in each district to make it more of a campaign issue for these assembly races. And by the way, it is this year for some of the candidates running who I feel really strongly about. Again, I'm endorsing a number of corporate-free candidates, very much in favor of single payer. I'm very excited to have them on board because we have to get those candidates to win. Traditionally, those candidates have not been winning against the more moderate Democrat.
Is part of highlighting this contrast taking on Gavin Newsom, who is obviously not the most popular person in California, given this recall effort that I was sweating bullets about. Are you willing, are people involved in this campaign willing to call out Gavin Newsom directly for being corrupted by money from these pharmaceutical interests? And also I don't forget which doctors group he was sitting with during the famous, unmasked ball at his house. Are you prepared to call out Gavin Newsom as corrupt?
Well, I've made it very clear that he hurt the cause in trying to get votes for this. There's no doubt. And by the way, in the recall election, not just myself and other single payer advocates, the nurses were very much supporting the governor, just like they did in 2017 when he was running. And so it's very disheartening that he's distanced himself. And I think that if this bill moves forward, including it goes through Assembly, goes to the Senate, and becomes more of a reality in terms of getting to his desk, I think all bets are off. I think everything needs to be done to push the governor to do the right thing.
Why not use the word corruption? Because this was an issue in the Bernie campaign too. Zephyr Teachout wrote a really great op-ed talking about Joe Biden's corruption. Look, corruption is a word. It has a meaning. It's not an ad hominem attack. You take money from these interests and you work for those interests and not for the interest of the people that you're supposed to be representing. That is corruption.
I think our system is corrupted, absolutely. And I think that,
But do you think Gavin Newsom is corrupted? But do we have to read off those numbers again about the millions of dollars that the California Democratic Party has taken and he has personally taken for himself and his campaigns and for his pet projects?
Yeah, I think that, and not to mention this Kaiser contract, which I think was a disaster.
To distribute vaccines, even though they had no experience.
The Medi-Cal expansion, rather than going to our public hospitals. And there's a lot of us that are expressing, our grave concern about that as well. And so, I think the governor and a number of legislators, are certainly, fallen to the corrupting aspect of our politics. I mean, it's not illegal, and I think that's where folks, sometimes draw the line on whether it's corrupt or not. But something can be unethical and still be legal, right? And I think that, and keep in mind, there's one thing I wanted to mention as well in terms of the difficulty of beating an incumbent. So over a decade ago, California went from a party primary system to a top two system. That unfortunately has moderated our legislature because what happens is if you end up with two Democrats, and that's what happened with me. We end up with two Democrats in the top two. The moderate oftentimes is an advantage against the progressive when it comes to the general election because they can get the more conservative vote and enough of the Democrats, and they get all the money. And so that's moderated our legislature, even though we have so many Democrats. All Democrats aren't the same, especially in a top two system. Before we had the top two system, the primary was everything. And what happens in a primary vote? You move to the left, right? And so you move to the left, and what you do is you end up getting a more progressive candidate winning in the primary. We don't have that anymore. When I ran, I was one of, I think there was a dozen races. I was one of, in those dozen races where the progressive beat the business candidate. So that's why I'm so excited right now. We have a chance of getting four of candidates that are absolutely progressive that have a chance of winning even in this top two system. And so that's part of the reasoning as to why I say it's difficult to beat these incumbents. It's not because I don't think that it's not a worthy endeavor. I think it's because the top two system has been created. It was intentionally done so, by the way, by a Republican back when Jerry Brown was governor in order to pass a measure that would allow the budget to be passed by a simple majority instead of 2/3. What happened before, when it required 2/3, the Republicans had enough votes to block the budget. So Jerry Brown said, hey, I want to make it so budget items only need a simple majority. Abel Maldonado, who was a Republican not too far south back then, said, fine, he was a deciding vote because they needed a Republican vote. He said, I'll vote for it if we put the top two on the ballot. So it was a very coordinated effort in order to ensure more moderate candidates had a better chance of winning. And that has an impact. When I say it's tough to beat an incumbent, that's part of the reason why it's the top two system. If it was a traditional party primary system, it would be very, very different, in that scenario. And so that's part of the calculation.
Things like that, structural changes like that, are why a lot of people and a lot of listeners to this podcast are frankly over the Democratic Party. They're over it. And I hear you. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you a chance to tell our listeners where to find out more about those four candidates that you're hoping will give you the edge you need next year and potentially support them. But I got to say, the fact that the Democratic Party does so many things that are at odds with the interests of the people it's supposed to be representing is why a lot of folks are turning their attention to third-party alternatives or frankly staying home in larger numbers. And whatever the strategic calculations are here, and I really appreciate you coming and spending so much time, pedantically from my perspective, I'm sorry, walking through all these steps. I understand your decision-making calculus, but I really hope that part of what is considered in these moments is how demoralizing it is to people who are increasingly disaffected from politics altogether.
I absolutely understand that. I know that a lot of people were hurt, understandably. A lot of people that have been part of the movement, the nurses and on the ground, the activists, that many of whom I have many years relationship with on the community, doing criminal justice reform, workers' rights reform, legislation. And I'm going to continue to work with. But I understand how demoralizing it is to work within a system that has these built-in mechanisms that make it a lot harder for progressive change. In that case, the governor, we were facing at that time, because of Schwarzenegger, such a massive deficit, and because we didn't have enough Democrats back then, that deal was made, and unfortunately, that deal was hurt. And I wish we could take it. We can't take it back if we go to the voters. And I think if we took that back, that would have a dramatically positive impact on getting more progressives elected into the legislature. But those are the kinds of things that are part of the calculus. And oftentimes, and I'm not the only one that says it, but I've said it a lot over the last few months, that it's not just about the moment, it's about the movement. I think I absolutely got lost in the strategy of the moment, and forgot about how that impacts and hurts the movement and hurts people in the movement. And for that, I'm deeply sorry, because it certainly wasn't my intention to do that. I truly believe that there's an absolute path to get this passed. And again, it was done to save the policy into next year in a way that I believe makes it stronger and more likely to pass than if a vote was held. And again, people can rightfully disagree. I absolutely could be wrong. Like I said, I would never say I was perfect, but I've absolutely been wrong before. But I've had to make a lot of tough decisions. This is I was a public defender for 11 years. I had to make a lot of tough decisions when I worked there. Where a lot of people's lives were on the line. This was also an incredibly difficult decision for me personally, and I'm hopeful that with the benefit of this time that we have, that we can start a longer, more constructive education process. To your point, get more people on board that are well schooled and well versed into actual policy that can debate, and we'll be in a better position.
Well, just FYI, I know that all us folks in independent media would be more than happy to help you elevate what's going on. Do you want to let people know how they can support or learn more about the candidates that might put us in a better position next year, and where to find you on social media and whatever else you're working on?
So there are some really good candidates. Some of the districts, the leading candidates are kind of all corporate free. For example, in the seat in Alameda County, which is just north of me, there's Liz Ortega and Jennifer Esteen. They're both corporate free, both for single payer healthcare, and so that's fantastic. I think I'm hopeful one of them will win. In the San Francisco seat, there's Matt Haney and David Campos, both corporate free, both for single payer, and so those are two. I look forward to that. There's one that's critical, which will be a Republican flip. This is the only opportunity I believe that we have to get a Republican flip into a progressive. And that's Pilar Schiavo in the LA area. Corporate free. She was a union organizer. She was a nurse, and she's 100% for single payer healthcare. And so it's Pilar, and then Schiavo, Pilar Schiavo. Corey Jackson, who is a great young candidate running in a new seat in the Inland Empire, which has tended to be a little bit more moderate. I had a conversation with them, corporate free, single payer, dynamic young man that I think will be phenomenal. And so those are some examples of folks. If we get some of them in, I do absolutely, it's not just for single payer. I think for a lot of our progressive causes, it builds momentum for us in the next few years ahead to have even more bold legislation that we can get the votes on. More importantly, that we can set an agenda that's more representative of California.
Well, thank you for that, Assembly member. People should check out those candidates. I really appreciate you spending this hour with us here today. I know that people have been clamoring for more fulsome explanation about what happened. And I really respect folks who are willing to come on independent left media and talk directly to the people who do so much to keep the movements that you referenced alive. So thank you, and we'll be watching attentively.
Well, thank you. I have great respect for you and what you do. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. All right. This is a free episode, a free Thursday episode. If you want to hear more Bad Faith, you can subscribe to hear Monday premium episodes for $5 a month. This past Monday was a real banger of an episode with a couple repeat guests, Batya Ungar-Sargon and Thomas Chatterton Williams, talking about some pretty interesting subjects about racecraft and this Whoopi Goldberg fiasco, and should we be holding on to the kind of racial scripts that were put into place by people like slaveholders and Nazis? Should we be holding on with tight fists to the idea of Black or Jewish racial identity? Those tough questions put to very weighty intellectual minds. You can find that at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Take care of yourselves, and as always, keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you, and as always, keep the faith.